For just one time, I would take the Northwest Passage to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea, tracing one warm line through a land so wide and savage, and make a Northwest Passage to the sea. Westward from the Davis Strait 'tis there 'twas said to lie, the sea route to the Orient for which so many died, seeking gold and glory, leaving weathered, broken bones, and a long-forgotten, lonely cairn of stones.
Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
There are more of us than ever before. But it's always a question of quality as against quantity in this life.
You've got Westminster and the Bank of Canada saying the country is going to pieces practically every year for the last 5 or 6 years.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
Ed Turner, just one second. Once any you do not have a monopoly on patriotism.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Red Ensign Podcast. Here I am catching up on what would have been my usual weekend community stream. However, I was without a co-host and with a busy weekend full of chasing children. So you're getting it on Monday and you're getting it with just me. So you'll have to live with that. I do want to take this on primarily because one of the things that I like to make a distinctive of my intellectual contribution on the online right is that I track stories sometimes for years as they unfold and evaluate theoretical frameworks against what has actually happened. And so I want to continue to have this pattern of exiting kind of the theory videos into videos where I look at the actual results of the intellectual positions either put forward by this podcast or by related podcasts and kind of measure them up against reality. Before I get into some of those elements of the kind of community interaction, I want to draw attention to it is the week leading up to Easter. As I do every year on Twitter, I have put out a thread this year with elements of the Easter story corresponding to each day, as well as the full text of a related piece of scripture. Again, my position on this stuff has been that it is important to give kind of cultural prominence to it, but that you do not need my editorial position as an advocate of the online right on these matters. I simply present the scripture, present the related pieces of art, and I encourage you to follow along and meditate along with me as we go through Holy Week. I wanted to draw attention to an ongoing interchange that has occurred repeatedly between myself and other advocates for the idea of elite theory. Take this opportunity to kind of explicate elite theory is an often mischaracterized intellectual proposition. It is captured in the works of Pareto and Mosca and some of the other theorists from the time, but probably, in my view, by no one better than Pareto. And the argument is simply that in any political system, the overwhelming majority of political power resides with a narrow slice of that society, right? And that no matter how the political system is organized, you're always going to get this Pareto distribution of political power, where a very small portion of the society holds the overwhelming majority of political power, and that political power can be used effectively to enact their vision of the world. In this interchange, I was discussing with my friend and colleague, academic agent, the consequences of the energy crisis in domestic British politics, where he accurately points out that the British state will use the energy crisis as further justification for the pursuit of net zero. Net zero being the policy on energy which has slowly impoverished a wide array of Western nations, but none more severely than the United Kingdom, through the artificial increase in energy prices and the forced deindustrialization of the country as an immediate consequence of this. And he points out that because of the way that power and propaganda are distributed in society, it's overwhelmingly likely that this will not lead to an elite revolt, or this will not lead to a revolt of the non-governing elite. It will not lead to some kind of peasants' uprising, even if and when the United Kingdom gets to rolling blackouts. You can see this lesson played out in actuality in places like South Africa, where rolling blackouts are a regular part of life and did not used to be, and the population does not revolt, but simply accepts the new reality and creates a justification for internally for why this must be why it's okay, or why they should accept it, in order to avoid confronting the fact that they're not in fact powerful, right? The overwhelming majority of the South African population, I'm sure, would like to have the lights on all the time. But most of them, rather than confront the fact that they don't have any power to alter the situation, will prefer to kind of concoct some kind of story as to why what the government is doing is okay. And if the government is competent enough to put on a concomitant propaganda line, it makes the whole thing go over relatively smoothly. And I have pointed out to academic agent that the actual limiting principle to this kind of abuse of the population has historically been the competition between states. Now, it is the case that in the period after the Second World War, there has been a very intense drive among elites throughout the Western world to try to limit competition between states, because of the severe consequence of the violence that sometimes erupts as a consequence of the competition between states. I understand that desire. I'm sympathetic to it from a certain point of view. However, it is the case that without competition between states, in a system where there are a set of global agreements, multilateral agreements that consolidate policy across all potential rival states, what you end up with is this kind of stagnation and tyranny, because the internal political concerns of the elite, their sectional battles within either their own nation or within their element of the empire, start to dominate over the considerations of strengthening the state in order to sustain it in competition with other states. And so you end up with these ridiculous policies where green energy is very politically powerful when reckoned only as an inter-elite competition mechanism, because it's such an excellent patronage scheme. And add to that, it impoverishes the middle class, which is, again, when reckoning only as a power game within the state, that's a very valuable asset to the elite. These kinds of sectional battles only get checked when the elite within a given society have external threats, external measurements against which they have to be judged in order to prevent the behavior of advancing their sectional interest at the expense of the health of the whole. And you can see the way you can see how effective the programs to limit interstate competition have been, and how the consequence of that limitation of interstate competition has caused, for lack of a better metaphor, the kings of the earth to beat their spears into plowshares. Right? You can see this is a chart of U.S. military spending since about 1955, and you can see in 1955 the U.S. was spending almost 14% of GDP on defense. During this entire period, the U.S. has sustained repeated conflicts in maintenance of their empire, and yet, because levels of military spending have radically declined over this period, and over this period, you have seen the very aggressive conversion of military spending from an objectively efficient system toward a patronage scheme to redistribute funds within the United States. So you go from 14% during the Korean War to just over 3% today. Interestingly, U.S. military spending is significantly lower today than it was in 2010, even though there are significantly greater threats to U.S. supremacy than there were in 2010, which is kind of a local maximum of U.S. military spending in the period after September 11th. So it's a thought to meditate on, and you can kind of see how this plays out in a place like Canada, where the assumption of our elites is that there are no external threats or external competitors, or at least that has been the assumption for the last, since the 50s. Since the transition, since Diefenbaker was defeated, he was maybe the last Canadian prime minister who believed that there were external enemies that it was important for Canada to measure itself against and to be prepared to combat. And you can see how these inter-elite games go on. So in the episode that I did this week, we talked about bilingualism as a tool of elite exclusion. We got a very graphic example of this, where the CEO of Air Canada was forced to make an apology as a result of the terrible accident that occurred at LaGuardia Airport earlier. I guess it's a week ago now. The CEO offered an apology exclusively in English. You can see that the powers that be within Air Canada is like a semi-independent corporation. It's not viable without its relationship with the federal government. And as a result, the federal government gets a lot of influence in its corporate structure. And so the CEO is no more as a result of his monolingualism. And I'm sure that the next CEO who is selected will be somebody out of this kind of narrow class of bilingual people from, if I had to bet, I would put money on the next CEO coming from Montreal, and that they have a pedigree within this elite class. And so you can see how these kinds of nonsense games get played and become political priorities within the country in periods where the internal competition between elites is the dominant factor in governance rather than any external consideration. Okay, so all of that said, we're now going to come back to a set of stories we've been monitoring on this channel for some time. The principal story globally right at the moment is the conflict between Israel and Iran and its consequences for the global oil market. Those who follow my work will know that I did a video in preparation for the conflict about the effects of closing the Strait of Hormuz on the global oil market, in which I noted that a little over 24 million barrels a day could potentially come off the market as a result of a straits closure, and that represented something like 26% of the global market for oil, noting that a significant portion of that, the product that would come off the market, was refined product, not crude. Now, since then, we've seen the Strait of Hormuz broadly closed. Traffic is down by over 95%. But we have seen, unexpectedly, that an alternate route has emerged at much higher rates than were predicted by the IEA. So when I did that video, I noted that the IEA estimated that the Gulf countries could reroute up to 1 million barrels a day through alternate pipelines to go around the Strait of Hormuz choke point. Turns out that the Saudis have figured out how to reroute something like 10 million barrels a day to be dispensed at a port on the Red Sea. So this is part of the reason why the shock to prices in the oil market has been significantly less than what might otherwise have been expected. So you've seen oil prices something like double, whereas if I kind of, in that video, I characterized this kind of crisis as somewhere between the Iraq War crisis and the 1974 oil crisis. And the Iraq War crisis saw something like a doubling of oil prices, similar to what we've seen now. And I kind of expected it to be a little bit bigger than the Iraq War crisis. I expected more price action than that. And this is the reason why. This pipeline is obviously very vulnerable to potential Iranian attack, but at the moment, a very significant quantity of oil is being delivered in this way, and that's part of the reason why the state of the international market is what it is. That said, you're starting to see the states or jurisdictions with the smallest strategic stockpiles of particularly refined products see like serious consequences. So we now have oil rationing in a number of jurisdictions. The Isle of Man completely ran out of diesel fuel over the weekend. So you're starting to see shortages, and where the kind of where the lost supply is going to actually be felt. You see this, the first place you see this is in all of the remote jurisdictions. So the Isle of Man, we get lots of news because it's part of the Anglosphere. But if you were going around the South Pacific, you would find lots of places in the South Pacific that are having this problem as well. And again, we're seeing this first in refined products, particularly diesel, because of the characteristics of the stoppages in the straits. You can see this in a very large version of a remote jurisdiction in Australia, where you've seen near doubling of gasoline prices and very near doubling of diesel prices. You can see on this chart, we're not yet settled as to where it's going to be, but diesel prices, you've got diesel prices and diesel shortages coming to fruition across Australia. And if this goes on for very much longer, you could see significant rationing in places like Australia that have very limited alternative suppliers. So again, we talked about at the time stockpiles ranging downward from maybe 200 days of supply. And so 200 days of supply is kind of the most well-supplied nations, and then nations or jurisdictions, and then ranging downward from there, noting that you're going to see civilian rationing long before you see severe price shocks, demand destruction long before you see these supplies actually empty because of reserves for potential military operation. So that's kind of the state of play on the story as it goes. We're going to have to watch. It's very unclear right now whether the U.S. is going to take the requisite steps to launch a military operation to open the straits by force, or whether you're going to see a diplomatic solution, or whether this is just going to go on. At the moment, you're seeing increasing reciprocal strikes on oil and gas and energy infrastructure in the region. If that continues to be the pattern, it's not going to matter that the Saudis have this alternate route for delivery of 10 million barrels a day, because the production infrastructure is all going to be destroyed. So that's going to be a very serious problem going forward. And it's unclear at this point, even if the straits were opened as the result of some kind of diplomatic agreement, how long the repair of such infrastructure would take and how long it would take to kind of restart it and get back to normal operations. So I think in your own lives, you should be prepared for this situation to continue for the foreseeable future. And if you live in one of these remote jurisdictions, you should be doubly prepared for shortages, especially of specialized fuels like diesel, or maybe you've got something that runs on kerosene or whatever. Kerosene is especially vulnerable in circumstances like this because obviously it's used in jet fuel. And so if you've got a vehicle or some use for it domestically, you should be very concerned about potential shortages of the product. Now, all that said, I've been asked about Canada's position in this, and I was surprised to learn, looking into the development of the Canadian oil and gas industry over the last couple of years, that quietly some progress has actually been made in increasing the mechanisms for delivery of oil and gas from Western Canada. You might recall that early in the Carney government, there was a memorandum of understanding between the Carney government and Danielle Smith that they would seek to permit additional pipelines, etc. But there have been several outstanding pipeline projects, the most significant of which was the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which you might recall was originally an Enbridge project, was bought from Enbridge by the federal government, and then spent years under the Trudeau government, and then spent years in permitting and disputes with Native Americans. But it's worth noting that this pipeline actually is in operation today, delivering 890,000 barrels per day across the Rocky Mountains to the West Coast, and that significant portions of that oil actually do reach international waters. By the same token, there was a great deal of dispute over the Coastal GasLink pipeline, but also quietly, this pipeline has come into operation, and it has come into operation with essentially payoffs to the Native American groups that opposed it. And it has come into operate, and this includes the liquefied natural gas element for delivering some of this LNG to international markets. So if you look at Canada's delivery of natural gas, you can see most of Canada's natural gas exports. So Canada's gas exports have grown a little bit over the last 3, 4, 5 years. But mostly only because we have eliminated imports as an alternative, because we're now able to deliver to remote parts of Canada domestic liquefied natural gas. This is particularly a problem for Vancouver Island and some of the other larger populations on the West Coast. But we've been able to replace that as a source. And we're still in a position where pipeline exports dominate natural gas exports. But in the last couple of months, we have begun delivering liquefied natural gas to the international markets in substantial quantities for the first time. So despite the difficulty and the amount of money that's had to go back and forth in order to make this happen, credit to the Carney and late Trudeau government for actually getting this done. It probably should have been done a decade sooner than it was done, but it is an important consideration for Canada going forward that at least some of this infrastructure actually has been completed and actually is operational. So that's worth knowing in the midst of a global crisis of a global scramble for liquefied natural gas and a global scramble for refined petroleum products. Wish I could say the same with regard to refining capacity, but Canada continues to operate with extremely limited refining capacity domestically for reasons that are entirely political. You can see a similar story with regard to oil exports. There have been marginal increases in the volume of oil exported by Canada over the last 5 years, despite all of the various forms of political resistance to the growth of that industry. As a consequence of that resistance, those increases have been marginal rather than the kind of exponential increases that you might otherwise have seen. And we have been able to increase those exports by pipeline and by ship rather and actually decrease the amount of oil transiting by rail during the period. So you can see in this chart, if you're an audio listener, marine exports of crude oil have more than doubled in the last 5 years in Canada, and exports by pipeline have kind of marginally increased by about 10% over the period in question, while oil by rail has decreased marginally, likely as a result of replacement of capacity by pipeline in the period. So, the situation is not nearly as good as it could be in the face of a global oil shock like this. Canada might otherwise be in for a much larger windfall than it will be in for, but nevertheless, we have managed to have some success in developing this infrastructure despite a lot of political problems in doing so. The last thing that I wanted to note is that I've gotten asked a number of times about the economic prospects for the Carney government, what kind of economic reforms we might reasonably expect given the political constraints, and how long the Carney government will be able to sustain its current posture. For those who remember, the Carney government's first budget came out with an $80 billion projected deficit, the largest non-COVID deficit in Canadian history. As I said at the time, Canada continues to have significant capacity to borrow, particularly at the federal government level. And so we'll be able to sustain even this level of deficit spending for some time. Given the windfall that's likely to come to Canada as a result of this conflict in Iran in terms of revenue, the timeline for the Carney government in this regard has extended. So you will likely see revenues for the federal government come in significantly higher than expected. Whether the patronage spending outlined by the Carney government is a good projection or not remains to be seen. It's hard to say at this point. But it's likely that in an environment like this, even the borrowing capacity of the Canadian federal government is significantly higher than one might otherwise have expected, which means Carney will have a lot more opportunity to deliver patronage to protect his political position. Projecting exactly how long this posture can go on will depend upon what actually takes place as the USMCA agreement comes up this summer. I and many people do not expect that an agreement that a comparable agreement will be reached between the Trump administration and the Carney administration, which will have pretty severe negative economic consequences for the country. There's a lot of industries in the country that are dependent on USMCA in various ways. But with the oil and gas markets the way they are, the Carney government is suddenly in a much better position to negotiate and in a much better position to withstand the kind of economic shock that might occur as a result of tearing up the USMCA agreement, and very likely has a lot of more willing international partners with which to potentially work. It is very possible that the Carney government will succeed in its noted strategy of outweighting the Americans and dealing not with the Trump administration, but with the subsequent administration on a trade deal. Predicting whether or not there's enough borrowing capacity in the federal government for them to politically survive this maneuver, we have to see exactly how those negotiations go and what the trade terms will be in the absence of the USMCA agreement. But I would suggest that it's pretty likely at this point that the Carney government will take the opportunity of the expiry of the USMCA agreement to deliver a very large package of patronage to their client groups in the country and allow parts of the private sector dependent on USMCA to suffer. And that will be the economic reality in Canada until the Trump administration eventually fades and a new political dynamic emerges, which the Carney administration hopes will permit the restoration of some kind of status quo antebellum with regard to trade between the two countries. I don't think that's exactly how it's going to come out. I think you're going to see permanent changes in the architecture of the economy. But at the moment, we're all just speculating on exactly how that's going to play out. This is a story that we are going to follow as it unfolds through the rest of the year. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed the video.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.